The day they let me go, someone's phone buzzed in the back of the room and nobody silenced it. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. 18 people sat in that all hands and not one of them reached into their pocket. They just let it ring, that hollow, repeating vibration against a conference table. While our chief operating officer smiled and said the word restructuring like it tasted good in his mouth. I had been with the company for 6 years. 6 years of compliance work, of late nights cross-referencing clinical datasets against what the FDA actually required, of flagging things that made my manager's jaw tighten because nobody wanted to hear it. 6 years of being the person who was very good at her job and very inconvenient because of it. My badge was collected at the elevator. Not at HR, not at the end of a meeting, at the elevator by a facilities coordinator who looked mortified and couldn't hold eye contact. He handed me a small brown envelope in exchange. Inside was a check for 4 weeks severance and a single printed page, my separation agreement. I signed it in my car in the parking garage. 3rd level, concrete pillar, B7. I remember because I sat there for 45 minutes before I could make myself leave, and I stared at that pillar the entire time like it owed me an apology. What I did before I drove away, that part is important. I opened my personal laptop, the one I kept in the back seat for my evening MBA class. I had not touched any company system. I had not taken any files. What I had done over the previous 14 months was keep a personal journal, encrypted, stored on my own device, synced to a private cloud account I'd opened with a personal email address that predated my employment. I had written in it the way my grandmother used to keep a household ledger, dates, observations, specific language. When something felt wrong, I wrote it down. I had started keeping that journal not because I was planning anything. I started it because I was scared. Let me back up. The company was a mid-size pharmaceutical firm based in the Chicago suburbs, the kind of place that had a motivational mural in the lobby and a CFO who wore fleece vests 12 months a year regardless of weather. I joined as a junior compliance analyst and worked my way up to senior regulatory affairs specialist. My job, in plain terms, was to make sure that what we told the FDA matched what our clinical data actually showed. For most of my time there, it did. Mostly. Then we started developing a drug called Veritine. Veritine was a once-daily oral medication for a specific form of treatment-resistant hypertension. It was, legitimately, a promising compound. The phase 2 data looked good. The problem, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters, was what happened when we moved into phase 3. In a phase 3 trial, you're working with larger patient populations, longer time frames, real-world messy data. Some of that data was inconvenient. Specifically, there were 2 patient subgroups where the blood pressure reduction numbers were significantly lower than the phase 2 results had suggested. Not dangerous numbers, not a safety issue, but numbers that would have complicated our regulatory pathway and, more importantly, numbers that would have complicated the story we're about to tell investors. I flagged it. Twice. The first time, my manager told me the biostatistics team was still reconciling. The second time, 3 weeks later, he told me the same thing using different words. The third time I tried to raise it, he took me to a conference room, closed the door, and told me, kindly, even gently, that I needed to think carefully about whether I was being a team player. I went home that night and opened my journal. Over the following 14 months, I documented everything I could observe without accessing any restricted system and without taking any company property. I wrote down meeting summaries from calls I was legitimately on. I noted the language that appeared in draft regulatory submissions versus what I had previously reviewed. I recorded dates and the names of documents and what changed between versions, all information that passed through my role in the normal course of my work. I also wrote down the thing I heard in the hallway outside the executive conference room one afternoon in October. Our COO was on the phone. I was walking past. I heard him say, quite clearly, the subgroup data doesn't need to be foregrounded. It's disclosed. It's in the appendix. Nobody reads the appendix. I kept walking. I went back to my desk. I opened my journal on my personal phone and typed it out word for word. 2 months later, the company announced it was in advanced acquisition talks with a large pharmaceutical conglomerate based in New Jersey. The deal was valued at approximately $800 million. Veritine, its near approval status, its market projections, its phase 3 data was the centerpiece of the acquisition rationale. 6 weeks after that announcement, I was called into HR. They were very professional about it. My position was being eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. My performance was not a factor. They appreciated my contributions. 4 weeks of severance, COBRA information, a signature line at the bottom of the page. I signed. I took my box. I gave my badge to the facilities coordinator, who couldn't look at me. I sat in my car next to concrete pillar B7 for 45 minutes. And then I drove to the office of an attorney I'd found 3 weeks earlier. Because the thing about keeping a careful journal is that eventually you start to understand what it might be worth. Her name was Wigmore. First meeting was a free consultation, 90 minutes. A glass of water I never touched. She was the kind of attorney who took notes by hand in a legal pad with a mechanical pencil and who asked the same question 3 times from different angles to see if my answer changed. It didn't. At the end of the 90 minutes, she said, "You understand that what you've described, if accurate, potentially constitutes securities fraud." I said, "I understood." She said, "And you understand that if you pursue this, it will not be fast, and it will not be comfortable, and there is a meaningful chance it goes nowhere." I said I understood that too. She said, "Then let's talk about the SEC whistleblower program." Here is what I did not know before that meeting. The Securities and Exchange Commission has a formal whistleblower program. If you report original information about securities law violations and an enforcement action results in sanctions over $1 million, you are eligible to receive between 10 and 30% of those sanctions. You are also legally protected from retaliation, though as my attorney pointed out, the protection kicks in at the time of the report, not retroactively. So the fact that I had already been terminated complicated nothing, because I had documentation of the behavior predating my termination. What she told me next is the reason I didn't file anything for 16 months. She told me to wait, not because the case wasn't strong enough, but because the acquisition hadn't closed yet. If we filed, while the deal was still pending, the company could potentially course-correct or amend their disclosures, delay the transaction, muddy the timeline. If we waited until the deal was in its final stages, the documentation of what they'd represented to the acquiring company would be complete, the regulatory submission would be in its final form, and the paper trail would be fully baked. "You want to file," she said, when walking it back would cost them more than admitting it. So I waited. I found another job, a compliance role at a hospital system, smaller, quieter, better hours. I told exactly 2 people what I was involved in, my attorney and my partner, who sat across from me at our kitchen table one Sunday morning and listened to the whole thing and then said after a long pause, "So we just keep living normally until it's time." That's exactly what we did. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I watched television. I went to bed. I did not check the news about the acquisition every day. I checked it every 3 days. Because checking every day was making me someone I didn't want to be. My attorney handled everything. My job was to answer her questions accurately and quickly and otherwise live my life. 16 months passed. The acquisition was scheduled to close on a Thursday. I know this because my attorney called me on the Wednesday afternoon before and told me that the closing meeting was confirmed for 10 a.m. the following morning at the acquiring company's law firm in downtown Chicago. She told me that the SEC had been in contact, that our submission had been received and was under active review, and that she had reason to believe the timing of certain communications to the acquiring company's outside counsel was going to be relevant. I asked her what I should do. She said, "Go to work, come home, make dinner." I did. At 11:47 a.m. on Thursday, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. A man's voice, measured, deliberate, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent 20 years saying difficult things to important people without flinching. He introduced himself as outside counsel for the acquiring company. He said he was calling because a document had been introduced into the closing meeting that morning that referred to an SEC whistleblower submission related to Veritin's Phase 3 data. He said his client had questions. He said he would very much appreciate a return call at my earliest convenience. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage. I was on my lunch break, and I listened to that voicemail 4 times. Then I called my attorney. She picked up on the first ring and said, "I know, don't call him back yet. I'll call you in an hour." 63 minutes later, she called back. What she explained to me is this: the closing meeting had stalled. The acquiring company's legal team, upon reviewing a supplemental disclosure that had been filed as part of the SEC's preliminary contact process, identified a material inconsistency between the subgroup data as characterized in the acquisition documents and the subgroup data as it appeared in the actual FDA submission appendix. The deal was not dead, not yet, but it was not closing that day. My attorney told me to go back to work. I went back to work. I ate my lunch at my desk. It was a turkey sandwich and I tasted absolutely none of it. The acquisition did not close that Thursday. It did not close the following week either. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not something I witnessed directly. I was not in any rooms. I was not on any calls. I was represented entirely by my attorney and, eventually, by an SEC enforcement attorney I spoke to by phone twice. But I can tell you what I know from the records that are now public, because this matter was resolved through a formal enforcement action, and the relevant documents are on the SEC's website. The company had, in the materials provided to the acquiring company's due diligence team, characterized the Phase 3 subgroup outcomes in a way that was technically not false. The actual numbers were in the appendix, but that was, in the opinion of the enforcement staff, materially misleading in the context of an $800 million acquisition. The acquiring company, once they understood what was in the appendix versus what had been foregrounded in the executive summary, revised their valuations significantly. The deal ultimately closed at approximately $610 million, a reduction of nearly $200 million, with additional representations and warranties and an escrow provision tied to the FDA approval timeline. The COO, the man who had smiled at the all hands, the man whose voice I'd heard in the hallway outside that conference room, resigned before the deal closed. He was not charged criminally. The company, as part of the SEC resolution, paid a civil penalty. My attorney called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me the enforcement action was finalized. I was at my desk. I closed my office door and she walked me through the numbers. The sanctions crossed the threshold for the whistleblower award. My share, after legal fees, was more money than I had made in the previous 4 years combined. I didn't cry. I had expected to cry. I sat very still and thought about a conference room with the closed door, and a manager who chose his words carefully, and the question of whether I was a team player. I thought about the way you learn, at some point in your career, that being good at your job and being safe at your job are not always the same thing. I had learned that lesson in my 30s, sitting across a table from someone who needed me to choose between them, and I had made my choice quietly, and I had written it down. What I want to say to you, and I mean this in the most practical, least dramatic way I can manage, is that documentation is not paranoia. Keeping a record of what you observe, in your own words, on your own time, on your own device, is not plotting. It is professional self-preservation. It is what my grandmother would have called keeping your own house in order. I kept my house in order, and when it mattered, the numbers in the appendix told the truth whether anyone wanted to read them or not. I still work in compliance. Different company, different city now. We moved after everything settled, for reasons that had nothing to do with the case, and everything to do with wanting a kitchen with better light. My partner makes coffee every morning at 6:15 and leaves mine on the counter before they leave for work, and I drink it standing up, looking out the window at a backyard we did not have before. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows a long wait. Not empty quiet, not relieved quiet exactly, something more like earned. There's a version of this story where I become someone I wouldn't recognize, where I go home the night my manager closes that conference room door, and instead of opening a journal, I open a bottle of wine and decide that staying quiet is the same as staying safe. A lot of people make that choice. I don't say that with any judgment. I understand the math of it. You have a mortgage. You have a title you worked years to earn. You have a manager who is being kind even while he's asking you to be less than what you are. The calculation feels reasonable in the moment. But here's what I've come to understand about that moment. The one where someone asks you to look away from something you know is wrong. The cost doesn't disappear because you don't pay it immediately. It just compounds. And eventually, somewhere down the line, someone pays it. The patients who deserved accurate data, the investors who deserved honest disclosures, the next compliance officer who gets walked to the elevator for asking the same questions I did. What I did was not heroic. I want to be clear about that. I kept a journal. I found an attorney. I waited. None of those things required courage in the dramatic sense. They required something quieter and, I think, more difficult to sustain. They required me to stay honest about what I'd seen when the easier path was to reframe it, to give it the benefit of the doubt, to decide that surely the people with more authority and more experience had already considered all of this and knew something I didn't. They didn't. They just had more to lose by admitting it. What I've learned, and I mean learned in the way that gets into your body, not just your head, is that integrity is not a single decision. It's not the moment you refuse to sign something or the moment you walk out a door. It's the decision you make on an ordinary Tuesday to write down what you saw, and then again on a Wednesday, and then again 3 weeks later, when nothing has happened and you start to wonder if you're being dramatic. The habit of being honest with yourself, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one is watching and no one will ever know. That habit is what makes everything else possible. My attorney, Whitmore, told me something in our first meeting that I've thought about many times since. She said the law can only work with what exists on paper. It cannot work with what you remember, with what you felt, with what you're certain happened but cannot prove. What I had in that encrypted journal on my personal laptop was paper. 16 months of it. And that translated directly into an enforcement action. A penalty, a corrected deal, and a check that changed my life. The version of me who closed her laptop that October night and decided it wasn't her problem, she wouldn't have any of that. She'd have a slightly easier few months, and then the same layoff at the end of it. Because people who need you to stay quiet don't keep you around once the deal closes. She'd have left that parking garage with 4 weeks of severance and no leverage and no record of anything. I think about her sometimes. I'm glad I'm not her. The patience I kept through those 16 months, the precision I brought to every journal entry, the willingness to do the right thing, even when it was slow and uncertain and completely invisible to everyone around me. Those are the things that actually mattered. Not the outcome, though I'm grateful for it. The things I built in myself during the waiting, that's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Keep your own records. Do your job with care. When something is wrong, name it to yourself first, clearly and honestly, and write it down. The rest has a way of following.